Hello everyone, another question and answer video today. This is a comment to the video Lamellar Armor, a foreword that I made a couple of weeks ago. So it simply goes, question. Todd's workshop is soon going to release their next experiments of longbows versus Agincourt era French armor soon. And so I would like to ask, are there any moments in medieval history where you think there is a lot of ground that we can gain through experiments in a material history that are less famous than the English longbow question that ought to get more attention, and why? Alright, first of all, I'm going to probably disappoint the author of the question because the latter offers me the opportunity of making a much broader consideration, but it will be to the point at least. So, I'm going to disappoint the author because my answer is fundamentally no, right? And to make it very simple, if you don't want to listen to the whole thing, but amicably, I know I'm actually making a point that I think is very, it is really important for the meaning of this question and also for all the testing, in fact, the experiments that are done with replicas and other reconstructions, right? So first of all, I'd like to point out that I'm not sure about this, I'm just guessing that since my video about lamellar armor was basically showing and or discussing also, in fact, a very broad set of, say, military cultures and in a wide, an equally wide range, in fact, of times and places that, I may have in that video given the impression that there is definitely much more to know about many other military contexts, right, in the history of warfare and so on. So the question does seem to me to be starting from there, because that's eventually what it really gets down to. And as I was saying before, the answer is no. I don't think, let's say, that there are any other specific times and places in history by approximation regarding that specific medieval dimension, right? Here the question goes, are there any moments in medieval history, right, where you think there is a lot of ground that you can gain through experiments in material history, right? There are less famous, for example, than one of the English longbow question. Well, no, I don't think so, right? And I don't think so for two reasons. One is more general, that is to say, whenever we look at warfare, and especially the less developed the cultures historically. So when we talk about medieval times, you look roughly, at least, the most advanced civilizations in the world were pretty similar among each other, right? So we talk especially about Eurasia, and as I was pointing out in that video about lamellar armor, but eventually you look at pretty homogeneous standards, right? You can look definitely at other contexts comparatively, but the reason why other peoples at the time had not, were not as advanced as the Europeans, like the Asians in general, by the way, because there are Europeans and Europeans, Asians and Asians, etc., is that their respective contexts were in fact not even coping with a threat from the most advanced areas, and so it's really not much of an issue. Now, naturally, if you see, I don't know, the conquistadores in the late 15th century, the early 16th, in the Americas, you have there kind of another comparison, and I think even that differential, let's say, is not particularly usefully, say, explainable through material culture, because that actually makes even a broader case for the general problem, is to say that technology in general doesn't quite make much of a difference in warfare, right? And I mean it by far, right, by magnitudinal scale. And this is what I will make clear in this video as well, because I talked a lot about technologism in warfare. I used to be very vocal about this topic, especially when I made the von Clausewitz videos that I will have to resume soon. But in general, it's a broader point I always make in my videos, and surely I was making it in the same video about lamellar armor, that after all it's just, a structure. It doesn't speak, doesn't tell anything by itself what kind of material, what kind of broader quality or effect it really has. It's just how you build it, and so the advantages that it can offer are such only when you actually look at the unhomogeneous level of quality that in fact still tells us that these differences are minimal, even in a broader, in a strictly opological context, and practically influent in a tactical or even more a strategic one, for not talking, in a political, cultural sense. So this is partly the point, and this is what I mean, because if material testing were made like in a context versus like a Native American and a conquistador, what's the point? You would have a massive technological unbalance, but it's by far more than that fundamentally made the difference in practice. And we're talking primarily about the political divisions among the same Native Americans, the fact that Europeans came overloaded with a much more impacting moral force on these people, and much more of which, again, the technological outfit is just an epiphenomenon of, right, not quite the hardcore issue of the matter, right, which is always essentially a political one and one of moral force. I partly discussed this latter aspect in that book review about Diamond. What's the title? Germ, Steel, whatever, which I disagree completely with, as most people to this day, frankly, because it's not a mystery for everyone that it's a simplistic explanation. But there is something in that book that is usually not pointed out. That is to say that in a book dedicated to that kind of broader moral, technological, cultural differentiation between the various continents, greatly separated. They were always in contact, telling the truth, throughout all the time. It's just that they were not intensively so. But there is not even the name, say, of Alexander the Great in it. And when you realize what these single figures, like others, really changed in the broader scale of things, and you really want to make it a purely either environmentalistic or technologistic or materialistic or structuralistic issue, well, these analyses are not going to stand on their feet. The other point why I think we can't get too much information through material testing is also even by the homogeneity, as I was saying before, instead of most of the cultures that developed also the most documented arms and armor of the time. That's why I think that after all, a war like the 100 Years one in Europe between countries like France and England that were, materially and technologically and practically and culturally homogeneous, answers that question. That is to say, they had basically the same technologies. And the reason why something very interesting happened, for example, in a different type of tactics, especially from the rest of Europe, right, not just from the French, by the English there, is something you want to, first of all, should be put also in perspective, because very often we think that was kind of a, some sort of unicum in a, let's say, in a kind of non-obvious way, or how who and how and why would invent or use that tactics, which is normally how we address things, let's say. But the idea of having infantry wings and relying on fire volume in a chamber of death, the famous Herz, and so on, was not new to English armies. The same reason why the English men-at-arms dismounted to fight is partly doctrinal. It is true. This does have to do with the important nature and character of the English monarchy from a political institutional way, but it was basically forced by the tactical and even strategical, of course, contingencies. That is to say, when you are in overwhelming numerical inferiority, well, there is an intrinsic advantage that defense also provides and you with, and as we all know, like the odds in most of the greatest English victories of the 100 Years' War were overwhelmingly in favor of the French. That is to say, it was not like what does decide this odd, right? From the chroniclers of the time, we know like there is no surprise in a broader sense, as if the English tactics had been per se miraculously styled to obtain victory. What chronicles of the time, any source of the time, actually explains to you is that albeit the two approaches were relatively different. This, first of all, again, were different mostly because of tactical and strategical contingencies of advantage and disadvantage. But again, the odds were actually, like in most battles, balanced, right? Of course, up to a certain point, balanced in the sense that the French, yes, had an overwhelming advantage, but the reason that they spoiled it hardly lays in the English tactics per se, right? So this outcome was not expected, mostly in the measure you would not expect that in general, right? It was not perceived like an incredible enterprise to defeat the English army in the first place, especially considering the hosts that the French could draw, right? So the point there is that actually English armies were much more similar to the rest of European ones than we normally think, and that, of course, certain successes were struck because of an evidently systemic reason that makes actually the English army, yes, in absolute terms in history, considering in comparative numbers, right, the amount of victories, the strongest army in history. There is no other army in the history of mankind that scored those hits in the same way, right? And this is purely a mathematical calculation, right? It's not a matter of personal opinion. You can, but of course, in the art of war, it doesn't stop there. You must explain why and how, and that's where it gets really complicated, because we don't have the entirety and, of course, this scientifically absolute certainty of what were all the political, strategical, and tactical factors that played to make a difference. So you can imagine at this point by which degree a different type of armor or what can the performance of a bow really can have to do with a wall. Practically nothing. And virtually nothing, literally, in the sense that it's not useful in a strategic education to be taken in consideration. Now, the point, though, is that today there are lots of people that are particularly invested in this and interested in general in this kind of experiments with replicas. Here, Todd's workshop is mentioned. If I'm not wrong, I do know the work of this guy, who essentially represents a bit like the pinnacle of, let's say, accurate, provides us with the pinnacle of accurate replicas, at least in relative terms to among who does these things today, and that has been involved exactly in kind of getting closer to what was the what was likely, and that's the problem really. Perform What were these arms and armor really about? Essentially, in this case, looking at the more famous, as the question acknowledges, context of again, English longbow versus Agincourt era French armor, and Agincourt era French armor was the type of armor that all Europeans used, including the English and anyone else, especially in Western Europe. So the point is, first of all, yes, you already get what the issue here is that the whole thing gets down to, let's see what happens if I shoot this arrow against an armor at a given distance, right? And assuming that the reconstruction, the replicas of the longbow and of the armor are, up to, are correct, right? Are at least very, very, very accurate and very close to the time standards. And this thing, as you probably know, for anybody who has gotten interested ever in these topics, has a bit been monopolizing the attention towards medieval warfare, right? If you look at the broader, let's say, interest that exists between, let's say, medieval history to medieval warfare in general, towards properly the history of it, that is to say, can be in fact, say political events, but campaigns and battles and so on, and arms and armor, you realize that the first interest, the first is interest a much more generic audience that also mostly doesn't know what the hell the whole medieval history really means. Like, they follow those documentaries either because they their country, or what they think their country was at the time, figures in it, and or do not really have a really much of a historical background. They can learn from it, absolutely, but the point is that they will not, because you do not really learn history just by listening to YouTube videos. And then there is, it may be kind of a niche topic, but it still has a very consistent type of following, especially, it seems to me, from the reenactment humanist and community in general, and also by lots of people that have mostly this kind of very I would call an individualistic kind of first view attitude towards warfare in general, right? Starting from individual combat mostly, and these two environments mostly cut out completely what is mostly the actual art of war and its history in a broader sense of political, strategical, historical, and cultural education, in fact, that is required to especially study the purely military dimension, and so the entirely military dimension of the issues. That is to say, as I often repeat, the study, at least, of the campaign and the battle in actual detail from the sources, with a specific competence about which is not unreachable, let's say, but it must require and not even necessarily a very specific set of pre-packed set of knowledge. It has to be mostly actively a consistent, repeated, continuous, absorbing and comprehensive study of this kind of sources. And this is usually not done, and it kind of explains the whole point. Like, very often not even scholars do this, right? Scholars mostly study one military context because contingentally, maybe they may study just one battle once, and then maybe they don't have an exquisitely military historical curriculum, let's say, and so they lack that diachronic and comparative capacity that fundamentally the history of the art of war, so practically the evolution of armaments, tactics, strategy, and so on, really really requires in order to have an objective, sound understanding, right, in perspective of the dimensions that we're really discussing. As a consequence, what normally seems, in my opinion, to emerge from especially the latter's sphere of interest, let's say, towards arms and armor, and this what would be effectively an apological interest more than else, rather than even than a tactical one, telling the truth, that very often does obscure that broader dimension. I mean, most, again, of I'm actually planning to make a video about this soon at some point, is to say my personal experience with that specific world, and this, so not wishful thinking based on prejudices, but what I actually saw in it made me extremely cautious, first of all, about anything that mostly comes out of it, because in part it's that it's not, let's say, the thing is not wrong in itself, right? The problem is what standards you use and what kind of especially objective do you have concretely, because as you know, I do this for a living, and it is somewhat pointless to me to pretend that there is any concrete and useful and expandable and positive knowledge that we can derive from these tests. That is to say, rather than with warfare, even just with tactics, I think these tests are more useful for history of, first of all, for history of production, but mostly of economics, of material culture, of how and why this equipment was really made, etc. Of course, this cannot be understood without a military background either, right? But let's say also I think that part of the reason why there is that broader influence is that most of the background from which this interest really comes is not strictly historical. It's mostly archaeological in a way. And secondly, and believe me, also there shouldn't be a divide between historians and archaeologists, but in practice, again, through my own experience, which is also pretty wide in that sense, there is a massive one. That is to say, truly, it's extremely difficult to find an archaeologist that has any sensible competence in military history, and most of the claimed one derives, again, mostly from the specific focus on arms and armor that, frankly, are the least important aspects of warfare. Not that they are unimportant at all. They did make a difference. But again, in the broader scale of things, even in a single engagement, they are really virtually insignificant. And I'm not kidding, right? And my greatest effort in this sense, also on Schwerpunkt, has been trying to provide as many people as possible properly the scalar measure of this virtual insignificance. Again, not because I have something against what these people do. I think it's interesting. I think that if I like to watch these tests, these experiments myself, they're fun. Let's be honest. They're interesting in a broader sense. They make you learn something, and surely there are lots of things that are connected with this type of testing. Sometimes the enormous also archaeological competence, the concrete, in fact, also application sometimes in certain given contexts, even HEMA, even other disciplines that are very, again, below standards, not because of themselves, but because very often of how, unqualified background mostly doesn't make them become what, again, they could be in potential. Because if one does not understand this divide, it's even difficult to to make a difference with this test in the first place. It's like beating a dead horse. Like, why would you even do this? Once that you have making a broader consideration, we'll talk more about this now, even when you have demonstrated that, I don't know, an arrow, and again, which particular type, and most of the times we don't have really a precise idea of this, right? We can have an archaeological evidence of something, but not having the palest idea of which was the scale by which it was employed. All right, so given that this whole arms and armor system was part of a much broader system that, again, is political, military, and social at the same time, what kind of hope do we have to understand it if we don't look at the broader thing, and even refusing to acknowledge how much that per se is worth within that system? And very often in the same historiography, in the same academy, not still having started to get the ABC of medieval warfare right. And you would be surprised by how big this problem is, right? And it's enormous. It's by far more important than any material test that we can get. And secondly, again, even if we got kind of a standardized certainty about, okay, this type of armor, this type of longbow, and we and this type of arrow, whatever, and we kind of set approximately the ground for this test to be carried out in a way that we assume to be somewhat accurate, what is going to be really the broader difference that the degree of penetration of this arrow really has in a given armor, right? What do you do with that evidence? And the answer can be a lot of things, but again, if you don't don't put it in perspective with the broader system, it loses of meaning, because it's just an engineering test. It's not combat. It's something completely different, and one must enter the logic of combat, not the logic of physics. Because even though combat is, of course, bound to laws of physics, even these ones are, the ones that interplay are factorially much more, and individually in this sense much bigger than what degree of penetration really an arrow's hip has on an armor, right? Fatigue, ground, weather, visibility, all things that you cannot even you don't know anything about, because you cannot reconstruct them. No source talks about these things in a quantifiable way for fitting this in a kind of positivistic hope to sort out the system physically. And so again, what's the point of it? Oh, that's my greatest concern, right? And that's why I always have a broader distrust towards this broader background. And I'm not even, of course, I'm not talking about this specific question or the old or whatever. I'm talking really in general, because this is always the problem that I'm presented with at the end of the day. Because whenever also I'm posed these questions, they're a bit all kind of similar, like they're always kind of revolving around the same thing, right? Because even if I said, I don't know, I think that if we studied 8th century India, we would find a much greater knowledge through this kind of reconstructions for improving our medieval kind of warfare knowledge. Because again, what's also the boundary here? Like, it's interesting. Why medieval history specific? Well, of course, the answer, I don't want to be an ass, but it's obvious. Yes, we are approximating. We always have to approximate in everything, and I'm the first one to approximate a lot, because otherwise we can't define anything. But again, how much can you define through that? And a very few. So, as I was saying, I believe that yes, if we're speaking about medieval warfare, 15th century Western European realities, of course, in the world at that time, by far the single best documented, right? Europe from the 13th century really starts being something else in terms of documentation. And interestingly enough, it's still dramatically incomplete, and basically and practically in this sense, we know almost nothing, right? But because we don't know most of the context, as always, just to make an example, about this longbow and this armor. Why would we consider this? And in which context? Like, the French dismounted man-at-arm that is entering the palisades while storming the English positions and is being hit at short range by a longbowman with a very precise type of tip design, also to cause more damage to armor. Or are we talking about, let's say, the also in other contexts, like a French cavalry charge, and how we don't even know the extent by which horses were armored, and whether in that sense, how would a longbowman adapt to that kind of thing? Of course, this is also in turn a very approximate point, because we know that at the end of the day these tactics were mostly volley fire, designed to disorder the enemy front and to slow down the advance and this kind of things. They're not really even meant to be considered as individual sharpshooting weapons, of course, even if at a closer range could happen. But the point is that if this would happen at a closer range, it means that the situation was pretty much messed up for a longbowman and his side in this kind of English-French contest, because that would be the moment in which rather the men-at-arms had to be sent to hold the line and to be fundamentally decisive, because heavy infantry / cavalry was the decisive element of the army, not the light infantry. It doesn't matter how performing their weapons were, and the longbow was not was a universal weapon. Everybody had it. Just the English had just provided themselves with more people equipped with that, and especially as professionals, to actually carry out a function that was not really even appreciated much of the time. If you pick Tudor England, you have, when we're still actually, in Tudor armies, longbows were used, and up to the mid 16th century, they were like the crossbow. They were still on the battlefields and with some important use. But let's say that there was this idea that the longbow had even become the symbol, a bit the national symbol and pride of the English gentry. Like, I don't know, the halberd too was kind of for the Swiss important in that regard. But first of all, there is a huge divide there too, because I don't know, the Swiss were mostly commoners in a broader sense, and they had made their state out of that, of a very different political culture, let's say, than the English monarchy, of course. But in fact, mostly in a feudal context, or even I'm talking feudal in the broader political institutional sense, not much how these troops were recruited. And still, yes, because at the end of the day, the contractors were the same English nobility and their retinues and so on. So professionalism changes a lot, and that's also one of the major differences there, that, as we've seen recently in a video about the medieval French army, is what mostly the French army problem really was. They had to standardize a lot of things. They had to, in terms of organic, of proper chain of command, of control. Those are the things that really made the differences. And as you understand, not even they were not even about combat per se. It's just combat would prove them in some ways, and it's always a matter of collective formation. But the point I care about, also because I just finished an article, well, not specifically about this, but about this broader disorientation that we have about medieval warfare still in historiography, is that, of course, the light infantry were the lesser people, and nobody liked them, because this was really the scum of the earth, and there was a lot of contempt and distrust. It was the same écorcheur. Think about the chevauchés and what the role of these troops really was. And there's been a mythology that has been built, of course, around specific tactics, specific weapons, and so on. Right? I mentioned my article. First of all, I would like to stress this, that I am a great admirer of the English armies of Edward III and of his successors here, talking about the Agincourt here, Henry V, etc. But I really mean, I used to call it historiographically Edward III's army, right? Because he was at least the one that he was the greatest military genius in English history, first of all, and the most complete one as well. And he perfected the thing, as you know, from his grandfather, also his father. They had already been testing it, and this thing of using archers in British, in that specific case, in English warfare, plus the Welsh that were subdued by that point, and that had nothing to do with the spread of longbows in the English army, by the way. English archers and Welsh archers were pretty much identical. Actually, most English archers were even paid more than the Welsh, right? The reason why you have so many Welsh archers later on is also that simply Wales was poorer, right? And there were more people who would just be hired from there. But there is nothing about, as we've seen, the longbow. Also, it was fundamentally just modified because let's say, not just this is simply a longer bow than the usual, but in Western Europe, we always made bows always and exclusively in the same identical way everywhere, right? Longbows used everywhere since prehistory, and it has nothing specifically national attached to it in some kind of nativistic kind of military war style. What actually happens in the English army of the 100 Years' War is that there is a monarchy that starts working doctrinally. That is to say, they start kind of arranging, let's say, not really a standard, but let's say a prepared, at least a preconceived tactical praxis that contemplated also the use of this men that were, however, what the army had in the first place, also for, again, reasons that are not strictly tactical, but just because they had them, right? And so they knew how to perfect it and whatever, but the reasons why this was so successful is the English monarchy and the specific character of that kingdom and country, for how it was organized politically and institutionally. And it has very few to do with any other kind of thing in terms of military tastes or whatever. It's a very specific, practical, intelligent predisposition of political, military, and social resources. So whenever I make a criticism to this idea of the longbow as the winners of battle, of course, nobody really believes this anymore, right? Somebody does, but just those that are not really into the historiography of it. But what I criticize, in fact, is mostly the latter, that still has maintained some sort of of posture, of attitude, of behavior, and even not just because of some, I don't know, you would presume nationalistic or issue. It's mostly at this point a modernistic and secularistic and materialistic and technologistic problem, right? And the fact that part of this is also reflected in the absence of a very well developed military historiography nowadays, right? And the reason why, in fact, this attitude is not somewhat changed too much is that there's no debate about these topics, because mostly we talk as historians only about the contexts that we know better, as I was saying before, mostly our own respective countries, and we very rarely look at the broader picture at, say, even just in this case, at the scale of broader Western Europe, right? And kind of, which it, of course, was the more important in terms of development in the continent, but it was within it surely different enough, and at least also differently documented enough for us today to really think it in a bit more complex terms than the ones that we have been used to. Right, I specialize in tactics specifically, so I'm also very allergic to those people that think that studying battles means to make the so-called histoire bataille, because first of all, those who made this Bataille were very good historians that at the time also elevated medieval history and warfare to unprecedented heights scientifically, morally speaking. They began to study war too seriously, right? And those who criticized the Soir Bataille were historiographers that, even though they were also more kind of socialistic oriented and so on, materialistic oriented, of course, were absolutely not, because they were still intelligent people at the time, absolutely not criticizing the interest towards warfare, or the fact that you shouldn't explain history throughout warfare, which is something that they themselves understood was necessary. They were just calling for something obvious, that you have to study everything, right? You cannot study warfare without knowing politics or society. It doesn't make any sense. What we have arrived today sometimes is the idea, so, if you study military history, you're just a neo-Nazi and a fanatic, and you have just to study a war in function of socioeconomics, not even politics, or elevating economics for ideological reasons to status that it really doesn't have in the broader branches of knowledge. Because talking about war is wrong, right? We are at these levels. I mean, literally, especially after 1968, this is the bullshit that has been used to fill the brains of most students, and that became professors eventually. Unfortunately, now they are retiring, and much more mentally balanced people are coming to the fore. Apparently, at least, much worse ones in telling the truth in terms of what they were even expected to do. But still, those who make the effort in this quiet traditional role, and so that emerge having kind of something interesting to say regarding that. Again, no, I don't believe that there can be such ground that we can gain through experiments in medieval history, through this testing, right? What I think we can gain enormously, there is always someone who wants to have fun making this test, so we will never run out of them. This is the problem. What we are already out, we've always been kind out of, is, again, the people who are capable of looking at these things and saying, okay, we know this and that, we can't think that there was a certain important dimension played by material, culture, and technology. There is no doubt. Technologies are always important, but they're not so important in the war, right? And so we need someone who understands deeply the war and the comprehensive view. Because, again, you see, I will try to explain why these tests are of relative usefulness. I'm not saying that they're dubious or that the people who do this shouldn't do them. Let them do that, right? I think that the effort is worth of the pain, just even if it was useless, to recognize as an important, this is Popper in the philosophy of science, to acknowledge in the first place. What I'm saying here is that these weapons and these armors were used in contexts that, first of all, we cannot reconstruct, right? We have, first of all, starting from the minimal aspects. Yes, we can have an idea approximately of what kind of the average objects were made like, with an idea of what they were made like for. If I'm not wrong, once I watched, so not very long ago, a video about Todd, who was humble, right, to say something along the pattern that, yes, I reconstructed this bow and this arrow and this armor, or whatever he does, in this that way because of this and that, and immediately from that from those statements, you could really understand what the problem, first of all, is. That is, how sure are we that what we are reconstructing is actually that one? Because you see, here we're not even talking about a standardized war. Yes, pretty much by the 14th to the 15th century, we have, together with professionalization, something that can go along the pattern of standardization of equipment. Right? By a certain degree, you can say it about any time in history. You can even say that migration era swords were kind of standardized, because in practice, they were essentially the same pieces conceived to do certain specific things, right? Except nobody really knows how they were also used. Again, there are people who say, I make medieval kind of Viking era reenactment because so I know better how Vikings used their swords. You don't know shit about how Vikings wielded their swords, because nobody knows, right? And nobody has left anything written. You have these pieces in your hands, but you should understand it in order to have any positive, useful, rational knowledge about how this thing was used. You should be a 10th century Scandinavian warlord that is habituated to chop human beings apart as a living, and all what derives from that from a psychological point of view. And you simply are not that, and you will never be in your entire life. But not only, you will never be anything that even remotely comes to the outskirts of what that was. You can't conceive that. You don't have the neurocognitive capacity to conceive the measure and the scale of how much you do not know anything about that reality. So don't flatter yourself too much. Secondly, the way you use a sword is not just knowing how to use it, of course, in single combat or even in next to each other in a broader sense. The problem is that we lack a broader knowledge. We know a lot, especially from a comparative point of view. That's where the broader picture is needed, right? Paradoxically, we know positively more about what we can theorize from a bigger scale, of course, than these aspects, right? Secondly, you do not really know, however, the measures of those combats either, right? You can try to simulate this or that, but if you don't have the mindset of those people, you cannot know how much effort you can put in that. And even if you easily look at how certain second, third world countries still use kind of actual fighting and all the thing, you can see that they don't look or do or act at all, not even remotely, how a reenactment in the spoiled, ignorant about this topic, this actual life, first world, exalted kids try to replicate throughout because they want to think to mentally alienate from reality, to pretend that they are somebody that lived 1,000 years ago, about which they don't even have a satisfactory education about. So this is the biggest problem in the first place. Secondly, the more you go on, and the migration era, Viking era, were kind of simpler systems that we can't guess in a way, but we literally are by most in the complete dark in terms, again, of the quantities that would be allegedly needed to reconstruct how eventually, going down the chain, how the individual would and what the individual would actually do, right? There aren't properly peoples today that even do that anymore, strictly speaking, the way they fought in the past. And even if you look at a brawl, or if you look at some hooligans, or other that you really see there, if you compare, I don't know, a bull-herd clash, etc., you really realize the difference between somebody that really wants to break each other's necks and those who are just there to pretend to do something, right? It's a massive watershed. And that really gives you a dimension of what moral forces really are in warfare, and why those are the overwhelmingly single most important thing that you should know about over any other thing in the first place, as a premise. Otherwise, all the rest has no value if not based on. Secondly, when you go on also in the complexity of warfare for what it is literally from a strictly physical point of view, that is to say, you have larger armies, you have more forces injected in that, you have, generally speaking, more friction, you have combined arms also delving importantly and being functionalized, etc., it's obvious that also while the material side of the story reflects what you see, the least important such material testing becomes, because what you are actually using is something that is framed within an even bigger and more complicated system to replicate, to understand, and to properly concretize and realize than even the simpler one we're talking about before. So about a longbow, or again, or a, let's say, a man-at-arms armor in general, the context is really something that should be taken in account. I mean, in order to understand, first of all, how useful an armor would be, you should be in an actual battle to get all the hundreds of blows that you can imagine. Of course, it's very easy just even to think about the longbow shower that would, arrows shower that would come from, and it was normally like in the broader skyline of any battle since antiquity, in terms of projectiles flying randomly to harass heavy infantry cavalry that mostly was not really much scratched by it, right? At best annoyed, at best disordered, but maybe enough again for the opponent heavy force, the opposing heavy force, to try to make a breakthrough, or to just make them collapse in a broader sense, and that therefore also the utility of these weapons were very often, and the effectiveness of weapons and armor was very often balanced, right? Again, sticking to the complexity, you have to think, again, hundreds of arrows arriving at you, maybe not literally, but likely we're talking about at least in the several of tens randomly arriving. No surprise, right? Kind of everybody knows that, but again, how many people have reconstructed that situation, have replicated that situation, and have known how many, I don't know, splinters would enter, God knows where, in the various armor joints, or how much difference would this make properly in a cavalry unit for maintaining its cohesion. What about the horses? Again, we barely know what was the overall degree of horse armoredness in the first place, as we, telling the truth, don't know about the whole army in the first place. Also, the targets weren't always the same. Of course, as we were saying before, it was normal to have light infantry, to have missile troops also from the other side. There's an article, I can't tell you, because I made the article just about this, and that has been made. I don't think it's a big deal of an article. If I want, I can also comment on it. But just to tell you how backwards we are historiographically to even pretend that we should consider other things other than this. But basically, this is the article of a guy from Mitchell. Yes, Mitchell, the longbow crossbow. I can tell you here because it's the abbreviated form. If I go in bibliography, Mitchell, the longbow crossbow shootout at Crécy 1346 has the rate of fire commonplace been overrated in Villanon, etc. The 100 Years' War, different vistas, Leiden, Boston 2008. Right, and I didn't like that article, by the way, because it was just it's a beautiful example of how many approximations you need to even get on a ground where you can stably and, let's say, reasonably make a comparison between even the units that were using those weapons. Right. These were units, by the way, that were engaged in other type of combat as well. Like, first of all, this is a bit one of the most underrated and yet vital aspects to consider. Men-at-arms were stormtroopers. Like, these men stormed castles, right? They weren't the commoners. Those followed and supported, but it was like that, just in siege warfare, like in pitched battles, right? So, especially combined arms are important, but we don't have to think that they are, let's say, the same, right? That they contribute the same. They are sure that their cooperation is decisive on the battlefield, but at the same time, I think it's fancier to think about a longbow shooting that even coming to grip with what, like, normally a man-at-arms in a battle was supposed to do quite concretely, right? And again, contemporary historiography, of course, barely even conceives what it means to just go there and kill somebody in front of you, right? And just wrestling together with them. And again, so somebody will say, "Oh, Schwerpunkt, so finally you admit that things like Bohart are maybe useful." Well, they would be if there were an actual context that was even remotely resembling that one of an actual 15th century battle, and not just, well, let's not qualify anyone, but let's say we presume that this has anything to do with that, right? And I know I'm brutal about this. I know I have a ferocious, unforgiving, intolerant attitude. But believe me, this derives from my direct experience when, again, understanding what the mindset, not of a 15th century man-at-arms, but of a 21st century, whatever, practitioner of such alleged reconstructions normally is, right? And I can assure you that it's not a pleasant experience. And I would like also to stress that I never argued with any of them, never had the chance, right? So I don't even come from a situation where, I don't know, have any particular personal antipathy. I just have dramatically, for just the broader outlook and what I've heard and read and seen, rather than what I had the opportunity of really discussing in any place, and also because I thought at that point it would be completely useless. Or even if it had been useful, it would have been useful, again, to be heard by someone, rather than, me getting some kind of insightful view of the wall. Now, again, I try to be. I know I sound aggressive when I say this thing. I sound offensive more than else, and even insulting. But I don't even here. I always target the general incompetence, right? That every person is able to make the difference, right? I believe this for everything, in every context, in any situation. Everybody can make the difference. What upsets me is when somebody pretends that they do something for which they don't have to make any difference or pose themselves any question, or pretending that, that's their world and nothing else exists. And everything has to remain the same. Because that's against physics, first and foremost. So if they are so obsessed with these kind of testing, they should start from the second principle of thermodynamics, or from entropy, and lots of other interesting things, and understanding what is really the nature of mankind before venturing this kind of materialistic obsessions. Of course, I'm not saying that people that are part of those activities do not realize this. They do, right? So it's always the degree, however, that, as I was saying before, mostly, on average, falls short of expectation, let's say. In any case, that's the point. Like, how can you, like, a man-at-arms in the 15th century would have likely given you an answer based on this broader issue. They surely would have even spoken probably in similar terms and looking at similar aspects and talking about similar elements of arms and armor that even again, most reenactors or emaists would tell you. There is no doubt about that. After all, we're talking about pieces of metal, right? They're complex things, very complex systems. They require a lot to be understood and how they could have been built. It's really a mess. It's complicated. It requires a great preparation. But at the end of the day, again, what happens on a battlefield transcends it by far. And it's rather in function of the battlefield that you have to think these the specific aspects are not just in function of one specific performance that can be even replicated, say, at this distance, this other distance, and then let's imagine what would happen when you have, I don't know, hundreds of hits. Yes, but how would this all get in line with the timings of battle, about which we don't know too much, right? What I would like to express is that real competence about these topics, say in medieval tactics, some of you was interested also to ask me, what should I do to learn more about this, doesn't get in skepticism at all, right? What I want to give from my videos is that I actually don't like skepticism at all. I think it's detrimental. I think that most historiography has gotten down to skepticism to the point of reducing people mostly talking about these other things, because the measure of how much we don't know is paradoxically the strongest mean to know quite concretely a lot of things about how medieval warfare really was. So what I'm making here is a purely mathematical concept. If, let's say, we don't know a good 40% about the whole battle and how it unfolded, right? And in that case, we would be even extremely lucky. How do you think that how much an arrow pierces an armor or damages it in the first by some degree counts it on the wall? And if it is easily much less than a 40%, why should it be relevant over the other bigger picture that we don't know and that we often don't know, also because we have not been habituated to reconstruct medieval battles? I've been just this article I finished today, for example, is based on largely 1/3 of it is about a battle, single battle. It was studied since ever. There are lots of publishing, etc., and basically nobody has still given an actual tactical reconstruction based on the analysis of the sources, right? And this is insane, right? I had to come from relative nothing, because I don't, my parents are not history professors, are not, like, that's something I simply decided to learn out of my own, to say, hey, look, that you've been, printing all this stuff and you haven't said anything so far. Why? Right? This is the greatest problem. Can I care when I reconstruct this battle about how much really a quarrel penetrated an armor and say, this is my problem? Obviously not. And you know why not? Because the sources do not give a shit about that. The sources talk all about, first of all, moral forces. And surprise, surprise, von Clausewitz does as well. They talk about leadership. They talk about the kind of formation, that how troops were lined up, deployed, and how these lines interacted in the battle, and what happened between them for whatever reason, distance, command orders, visibility, quality of the troops, whatever. Nobody gives a freaking damn about how much an arrow performed against an armor. Also because most of the hits wouldn't be the optimal ones, by far, right? Maybe just one would get, like, really that good approximate 90-degree hit at a decent distance, with a projectile loaded with enough energy to make a difference for that individual guy. And relatively so, because maybe, yes, maybe it happened against the armor, but the padding underneath was enough, and so nothing happened. Surprise, surprise. This is yet another thing that one should see. So, again, how did this latter aspect is more crucial than you imagine, because the fact that the people that lived at the time were the first one not to give literally a complete damn about the thing should ring some bell here, right? It's extremely rare to find in medieval warfare, let's say, one source claiming that one armor made, let's say, one weapon made an effective difference, right? For example, in all the Swiss battles of the early 14th century, there is only one. I don't remember which. Say only one source. I remember which one. Could even easily find that says that a halberd cut through armor, and it's just a statement. Like, it's not even part of a comprehensive, sophisticated view or explanation, whatever. No, if you have ever read these accounts, you know what they are like. They tell a broader story, more or less concisely, and the overall comprehensively all makes sense. And if you read them, and the more you read them, you more realize what they really wanted to mean. And of course, it was really about the whole battle in a broader sense, but also within the logic of the same. That comprehensive dimension to them was really important. And then there's all other details that somewhat added to look that this kind of thing happened. And of course, you have to be very sensitive there to try to guess what this guy might have really wanted to express in that idea, right? Maybe, it was just an exaggeration. It was not, but it was not meant to be a technologistic statement. It was not meant to say, look, that this armor can actually be pierced by this type of weapon. What they really cared about was to say, look, that we had these weapons because it's us, and we managed to cut these people down with it. And look, there's a halberd that cut through an armor. And it's just a statement, by the way. It's not the evidence that was the case, which was likely so. And in a broader sense, those who do make tests can find an answer to. But the reason why this information doesn't add anything positive about that is because even if you verified with a perfect replica of those of that actual arms and armor that you reconstructed on some kind of, let's give it for granted it's that historically accurate, what the hell do you know what this guy was talking about? Where is the connection? How can you think that even the archaeological evidence that you have this is yet another very important point. How much do we know, say, what was kind of the average weapon at the time? Or how the quality of it could be the same identical weapon, but it could be made of, weaker, of lesser quality. It could, but again, on the battlefield, the difference would be made is also relative to lots of other things that are by far more important. The morale of the troops, how they were orderly, they were trained, they were prepared, whatever. If they got in the battle, also how they had to. Right? Warfare is not about crushing against what is necessarily going to hurt the most. You're trying not to do it. You will be brought to do it, especially the largest the engagement. But in general, you're there to essentially outwit the enemy and to make an enormous effort to do it, also fighting, but essentially putting the enemy in a condition of inferiority, which immediately means that there is no such thing like an absolute value that, for example, a weapon has. Right? Archaeologically speaking, we know a lot of things, but we don't have the palest idea of what happened on that battlefield. How many troops were equipped with how many weapons, and of which kind of weapons, how were the subtypes and the types of, for example, the arrowheads. There were of different types, and presumably they were, yes, used how we hypothesize and for different performance. But again, the way they used it is unknown. The way the knowledge of that archer was to recur to that kind of projectile rather than another is something that you can't see, and that therefore that is all in that archer's head. It's not in that archer's arrow, right? And even if the arrow, yes, is a product of that head because somewhere somebody made it for that purpose, still there is no hard evidence behind that process that still answers what happened on that battlefield. Right? This is, again, extremely important. Another thing that, of course, von Clausewitz explains is that when we reconstruct battles, we have enormous difficulties, even if we are the ones that actually fought in those battles. If you read the various historical accounts, let's say about an average 100 years war battle, or maybe even just the largest ones that are more documented, and it's kind of dark. You see there, first of all, that there are big interpretational problems about the battle in itself. Right? Very often we don't know even the most important things, such as how many battle lines there were. Right? How were troops distributed? What concretely happened in that regard? And consider that at the time, again, there was hardly anything. Say everything could be adapted according to the circumstances, but this adaptation wouldn't catch off guard anyone. Right? The other presumption that we've made, again, is that you can't do so many different things on a battlefield that are going to make the difference. The larger the battle, the least things you can really do, right? And so the least surprise you can really achieve in practice. And the problems actually increase because you have to make a much bigger effort in maintaining control of a much bigger system on the ground. In all this, we are normally devoid of certainties, right? For a long time, the same formation of English armies has been somewhat misunderstood in the same historiography. Still today, we can't even properly have a certainty regarding some of the most important battles. Right? This is true again in general for most medieval battles, meaning what? That they knew, by the way, something that at a point they gave also for granted, per se. For example, why wouldn't a chronicler really write any of this? There are, first of all, different types of sources with different type of awareness about the battle too, and you should, for example, learn about their background, right? I just finished this work now, essentially correcting the work of a late 14th and an early, in fact, 15th century author that wrote about a battle fought in the end of the 13th century that, however, has ever since informed even modern historiography, and that knowing the background of this person and knowing what he wrote and making the first tactical analysis on that battle that has ever been made, came to the conclusion that this guy invented how the story went, or at least adjusted it in a specific way that fundamentally through also his own reconstruction reveals at the end of the day that things were a bit different from the one that was talking about, also because it was basing himself on other sources of the early 14th century. So these are the problems that at the end of the day explain how a battle is to be understood today. True, right? What kind of ground we can gain from realizing in each of these battles there were tens of thousands of quarrels being shot in an hour, in terms of what difference they made against an armor, that given that we don't even know normally which distance they were shot, and or if we do, again, we have problems about the size of the enemy and other lots of problems that, again, we can't even speculate about, but we don't have the evidence to prove. Well, how important is that? How important is that material aspect? Even given, again, that these armies that we're discussing are practically homogeneous from a material point of view. Just think about the crossbow, right? Why, for example, is there this, say, maybe let's try to answer the question also in a further alternative way, that is to say, maybe in the same context exactly, shouldn't we test, for example, a crossbow better? Maybe, I don't know, Todd did it and does it habitually. Good for him if so, otherwise who cares? That's my view on it, personally. But the point is, crossbows were all around, and they kept being around, and there were countries such as, I don't know, Lombardy, that produced longbows for the English army exactly in these years, and the local Lombard armies didn't have any longbow in use at the same time. That's a question that would be much more interesting to answer than, say, what kind of difference at that point the longbow made, even comparatively to a crossbow, because this kind of tests are done. But again, if we don't even know, generally speaking, what kind of crossbows were used, to the point of making the degree of the error in the calculation, let's say, controllable, what's even properly the energy spent in these tests worth, as opposed to an intellectual work on the actual sources, to understand what combat, so the actual real battle that was fought, and not our pretty lame 21st century take on how a weapon that we don't know performed on an armor that we don't know, to the point of, again, making a relatively arriving to a relatively correct conclusion for which there is no certainty. In this answer, I may be, let's say, maybe devaluating the precision with which the contemporary replicas are done. Again, I was looking at that video from St. Todd, and it seemed to me that it was not a bad work at all. Probably it's really the best that we can come to, also, again, because if there is also a minimal change, maybe it's, yes, you can always beat the record, but it's basically it, right? The point is, again, that we don't know by which degree this differed, and even the minimal one could make a difference. And again, just for a material impact, a physical impact, not for, let's say, explaining how these weapons were actually used. First of all, in collective formation, but even if it had been just for, remember, everything that gets to the individual in warfare is the least important. There is a direct proportion, inverse in this sense, proportionality, right? Everything that is designed for individual combat in warfare is the least important in absolute terms. The collective dimension is everything, right? You can say, but collective dimension is made exactly by this. Not really. The collective, by the sum of these things, no, because the collective dimension works in a different way. It's the same difference, the sense between the type of volley fire, let's say, and the precision one. They both existed, and they were both. These archers were trained to perform both. But what we have to realize is that the difference that was made on the battlefield was the type of fire. The type of volley fire was, in this sense, properly designed, even as a single shot, in a different way from the one that was used in the precision fire closer range, again, when everything was more or less fucked up because the enemy had come that close, and therefore an archer is not going to be the difference, because light infantry doesn't beat heavy infantry or heavy cavalry alone. It needs something heavy, infantry or cavalry, to beat it, and that's what's going to make the difference. I mean, who does even care what a longbow does in that situation? And again, much more in terms of, again, all the rest of Europe that kept using crossbows and just occasionally hired longbowmen from England, often because those were the guys who knew how to use it better, because they were veterans or whatever, and they could seek fortune that way, but still mostly not being prevalent, first of all, and also being constantly paired by crossbows, and also with different outcomes, frankly. And again, the same thing can be observed also, let's say, how probatory, for example, is the outcome of a battle. There is the Flemish example that I always make. Flemish history, of course, owes a lot to the Battle of Courtrai, right? Because this was a major victory, not just for the local communes, but the entire European, in fact, commune and rustici, let's say, that essentially defeated the flower French cavalry in that specific defensive fashion, also with just with a solely infantry army, by the way, led by knights, right? Not led by people that didn't know what it meant to in the first place. And that, as Villani's Chronicle says, everybody thought up to that they were just rabbits filled with butter rather than men. And so, big magnitudinal escalational historiographical impact of the Battle of Courtrai, everybody writing that in Flemish historiography, oh, this is there, it's Courtrai, everything is Courtrai. And you actually look at what that same army did later on in history. It was the same. It didn't change. It just added a bit of artillery because they were rich in the later centuries. What happened is that, except for Montpellier, where Philip IV risked to be killed and, the Flemish scored a success, but actually were about to be defeated by the French in a counterattack, and so it was kind of a stalemate rather than else, the Flemish army was continuously and uninterruptedly defeated in all the major engagements of its military history from there on to the Battle of Guinegate at the end of the 15th century. And by whom? By French Burgundian armies. That is to say, an exact copy of the French army that they had defeated before, to the point that, of course, the Valois Burgundy take over Flanders as well. And and that's it. And by the way, this system didn't evolve. It was kind of a practically non-professional system of the older burgher leagues, and it gets defeated. Now, this battle has been magnified, saying, oh my god, this is the beginning of the end of cavalry. This thing is infantry is the future. This is what. Do you realize what happened with it in the mid-14th century? Do you realize that at Guinegate, what you actually have is that, a major prince like Maximilian of Habsburg that actually copies, because of his princely finances, the Swiss model, by the way, which is a professional model for hiring essentially proletarians, just like the Macedonian phalanx was, the Roman legion was in the time, also in the most advanced times of their warfare. And the Flemish do not even reject to be trained like that and always remain a pain behind for the Habsburgs, because they didn't really care anything about them, more than they did towards the Spanish later, telling the truth. The Austrians, speaking of Maximilian, that's initial phase. So the broader gullibility and hallucination and distraction and lack of comparative capacities has inflated certain views, certain reads, certain interpretations of something that in the history of especially late medieval warfare starts being massively documented, etc., have still not been really correctly made. Right? You think, again, we are in the 21st century. We know really what late medieval warfare was, right? Like, there are experts that know this. No, there is not. Right? You will find what they mostly call themselves experts are people that are very competent, maybe in a single topic, can be even a single battle sometimes without having the petty study of any other, for example, as I was saying before, or a single country, single armies, but let's say never comparatively or structurally compared, for example, say studied together with the others of Europe at the same time, not really having also much of a method, very often mixing, say, this is a great work of military history, you read it, and maybe it's 300 pages, only 10 talk about the battle, and it's even poorly explained, because you understand that this person has never reconstructed a battle habitually in his curriculum, right? But there's all the interpretation of the battle in this and that work, and the cultural perception. You have to talk about warfare, talking about a battle. You have to reconstruct it tactically. You have to reconstruct the campaign to understand the strategy of it. Otherwise, what the hell do you study the battle for? And this is where we still are. It's not just a sky, a celestial vault constellated by stars that shine of great composition. No, it's just a giant, messy cauldron of indistinguishable knowledge that is bulimically produced, thrown in without any kind of care also for the rest of comparing. It's also the consequence of our times, because we write so much, and it's so easy to just write tiny things without caring about the rest, because you just are upset that for you must have a career somewhere. You don't actually care about history and making it. That I say we are in a bad situation. Also, at least you can read it through such things, right? And with the even worse understanding that this is actually the best humanity has come so far, right? There is not an alternative inside currently by someone else, other countries, other peoples, this is literally the best we have, and the rest is oblivion, and we're just reverting to the latter. This is the impression you really get, and so it's terrifying. And so whenever you think that probably I'm mentally disturbed, but every time I see Todd making those kind of tests, my hand is actually shouting all these things that I compress in a 2 hours video at once, right? And so that's what distances me from the entire question entirely, right? From the care or the use and I appreciate the question that it was posed, because I appreciate always genuine interest. Even sometimes they can be curiosities, right? Other times there are more interesting things to say, but from every question I always am able to address lots of important issues that I can try to expose better, and maybe can really make a difference, because I don't think my videos will ever be particularly interesting for a broader audience, but at the same time, were anyone of those who actually get into these topics thoroughly, it can be even the author of the question, may in fact get interested in them. The reaction that I pose, even if it's just, oh no, this guy's nuts, or I don't like what he says, or whatever, I think is just like a warning. Like, look, that the problem is much bigger than it seems. And it's not, let's say, very often people say, especially to kind of dodge the answer, because I also don't know much about the testing, the forces, whatever. They say, well, when it's something too complex, it also means basically I don't know anything about it, right? The thing I want to transmit is not that this is a complex issue that you have time to explore with it should happen, right? Especially if you are, let's say, in medias res, let's say, and you are researching these particular things, whatever, you should take all the time you need, and that's the only way you can do a difference. But what I mean is that the fact that we're still here, and the awareness of this problem, it's not about somebody will find out. The problem is the world is collapsing while we're trying to find out about these specific things that are surely not going to make a difference, and that's the most serious part of the story. So you would say, but Schwerpunkt, also your historical content doesn't make a difference in the world. Well, it's not about the content. I can talk about anything. I don't care. What I care about is the criticism behind it. And so I cannot stop criticizing. There wouldn't be any point in somebody's existence if they stopped criticizing, or if they entrusted, let's say, their hope that somebody can do or answer things for them, right? The effort that you must do is always yours. It's always about whether you get there or not. And if and others are already in the journey, and we are all in separated journeys, so it's also difficult to understand each other very often. So that, of course, if I talked to anyone who makes these testings in a serious fashion, and I had to compare, I would just sit there like a potato, not saying anything, because yeah, I'm essentially talking about something else. Yes, because it's beyond the thing. So there can also be a little reconciliation between these ideas, because I'm somewhere, someone is somewhere else, and so I'm not even sure that anyone would ever be interested in really discussing with me, because at the end of the day, many of you say, well, Schwerpunkt, you should make interviews with other YouTubers, you should discuss things with other. I'm not entirely sure that what I'm saying is so usefully laid out if I were to talk with someone else, because again, it depends on what you discuss. If you discuss in this kind of broad exchange of thoughts, to say, I think this, I think that, I think it can be useful, but if it were just for, like in this case, wanting to split hair, this question was useful. But I mean, were I to get involved and say, or expected to answer a question about the actual nuisances of such tests, I personally don't know what it means. So of course I'm also shifting the conversation what I know better, but I have the presumption that what I know is kind of bit more important in function, not because I know it or because it's a specific thing there or another, but because I think, again, by scale it's way more important, and it does affect what we're talking about, because this is an attempt to actually make a scientific point of it all, because the problem is scientific. If you're strictly speaking about the ground that we can really gain by studying material culture through these kind of testing, well, I think that again, what I'm talking about is by far more influencing the issue than the other way around. And in fact, the ultimate concept that I always point out is that most of the Deadliest Warrior kind of comparisons, so of course it's founded on, first of all, the premise that these fighters are equal in capability, which nobody really understands what it means, because again, there are different capabilities and they are developed exactly in function of something. But obviously it gets down to a more materialistic side of the story, is to say, look at the weapons that these guys have. Yes, of course, the weapons are lethal and they can really get the thing done fastly and efficiently, but for the context for which they are designed. That is to say, what never those clashes really say is that if there were a massive, let's say, if the odds were massively against an option, there wouldn't even be a fight. So that's why I realized I started the video by saying something could be equivocated, saying that the French had always an overwhelming advantage. Well, considering what a normal odd in war is, not by saying, say, the French were to win 10-1. No, that never happened, of course. What I really mean is that the reason why why even politics exist in function is that, and nobody rebels to them constantly, is that the cost benefits ratio is not, even if it's not bringing into for it to happen in a way. So whatever happens, and you make happen specifically, it's something you have to, it's always based on a balance. It's always unstable, and you have to struggle to keep it stable, of trying to do it. But the point is, again, that if what is the point that one would extrapolate from the degree of penetrativity of an arrow. That's quite difficult, because also for another point that is rarely made and that I was hinting at before, the say arms and armor are always in function of each other, right? You realize that rather than being really, let's say, effective, this is where people, I guess, could also improve their general understanding of these kind of things. Again, nothing to do with this question, but in general, I've talked about it in the videos about medieval sword, etc. Is that, yes, weapons were meant to be effective against armor and vice versa, but the actual result was an annihilation of both effects, right? It was not an actual effect, right? Because if, of course, here I'm making a gross concept and not saying, of course, that nobody believes that longbows were kind of, cutting through, men at arms in full armor, whatever. What I'm saying, and simply, that being a normal, easy thing to happen or whatever. What I'm saying is that, of course, when do you see armor disappearing? Where there are weapons that manage finally to break that that balance between the two things. And even if we talk about mostly elite troops, the 15th century is the moment in which there is more armor around on battlefields, right? And then it starts declining again, historically. But let's say, you could say, well, the majority still was not armored that much. Well, it would be also interesting to see how this thing floated over time, because again, as I was saying before, we don't know. So even the kind of weapons that were used should be considered on the basis of what other targets were created. Of course, these targets had to be the hardest in a way as well for, say, some weapons to be effective. And of course, with increase of professionalization and standardization, as I say before, in late medieval times, there is also, in fact, an increasing quality of the troops on the battlefield. And that's why it's also easier to answer the question. It's a very good time where you could concentrate your inquiry, and that's probably why we are so focused on it in the first place, because this is not about the British prevalence in the world and the fact that they revived naturally parts of their history in the process, but because objectively in the history of warfare, what happened between France and England was really very important. And it was really very advanced and documentable. So we would have used it anyway, even if we would have checked this anyway, even if, say, the French had won the 7 Years' War. This is not the issue. But when we look again at the, for example, the sword cut, you realize that the blades became ever more performing in cutting until plate armor came around. And then things starts changing. Right? So up to that point, you realize that even if it was not probably the particularly effective, we can see it through testing, to try to cut an armor, still the purpose of a sword was, in theory, to cut armor to the point in which you would destroy the sword as much as you would destroy the armor, right? And then the things start change in another situation. Of course, until, of course, swords are used. This is pretty much, I'd say, at least when armor was pretty much around. So, like in the 15th century, this is true as well. Like, swords were also meant to cut into plate armor by a certain degree. Right? It was extremely difficult, something that even there in the ergonomy of warfare doesn't mean anything per se, but the standard was conceived as such, like the ideal, the broader purpose and the broader target was that, because if you could do that, you could essentially go against anything that happened on the battlefield. Now again, this may also be virtually insignificant, but it tells you exactly what the point is regarding the absolute test results, that per se it doesn't really work, right? So when you see the thing on a bigger picture, you realize that the arms and armor, generally speaking, outbalance themselves. And that was their purpose. And then you could kill people in many other ways that were not that specific hit on the armor, as you know. So that was not even the broader purpose to get it over with in the combat as a whole. So what means to the guy to eventually surrender to your will, or to die in the process of resisting. So this is also the scale, more or less, that must be thought like. And the final point, again, is that technology, this is known to any historian of science and technology, and partly also of economics, has much less impact on tactics than the other way around. Maybe the entire point of this all is it really gets down to this, because the overwhelming prejudice, I would say in the West, but in general, because I don't think that elsewhere it's better at all. But the problem is that we have a right to think that technology, that is to say, a minimal fraction of what happens, is the answer for the war. Right? That technology is the thing that makes the difference. In other words, people literally believe that, I don't know, the Western Front in World War I was the one that it was because there were shells and machine guns. They don't understand that it was about the balance between Germany and France and England and Russia, and Austria-Hungary, Italy, the Ottoman Empire, etc. They don't understand that. They don't understand that it has nothing to do with machine guns, that on the Eastern Front were used in different ways. In Africa were used in other ways, and just on the Western Front had this thing not moving not for a few tens of kilometers, stretching from the North Sea to Switzerland for 4 years. The problem is exactly this. If you ask a person, an average person, and I found plenty of people, they think that trenches, so-called position warfare, whatever, approximated term, World War I was fought because of that. Right? Of course, it was fought also because of that, but it was primarily fought, like the war in itself, because there were two alliances, two systems that were fighting against each other, that had that proportion, that capacity of counterbalancing each other, not because they had machine guns, not because their entire power of cyclopic proportion could be stopped by a machine gun that would have been broken immediately, vaporized instantly, even by a tiny fraction of those countries' power. But because it was those powers were clashing against each other and counterbalancing each other. And technology would have accounted for a very low proportion. We're talking about even a few points percentage, right? The same thing is true for, and it is even more true considering, again, as I was saying before, that the odds are balanced also technological. They had the same technologies. So by default, they cannot make that difference by themselves, because there was not a major kind of revolutionary, crucial change in World War I technology. It was surely a further pressuring for adaptation, innovations. It was enormous, but the core of warfare remained the same, right? For example, the tank problem could not be resolved until the war was over, in a broader sense. So this is crucial, right? The World War I, for example, was not unlocked because, I don't know, tanks were entering the battle, right? Those would have accounted for as a minimal part. The tank doctrine of mobility would have developed just later, just after the war, after this had been fought. Up to that point, the obstacle was not surpassed, and this was a limit of technology itself. The same thing is true for medieval battles, what do you think technology really accounted for, especially again against the armies that had this literal same identical technological development? Zero. It's a completely different level of interest that one must have. Primarily moral forces. Primarily and absolutely by a certain degree, because no weapon is of any use by itself. Technology alone is zero. Everything is doctrine. All is doctrine, right? And how to make it work also. So, again, this is the answer to. No, I don't think so. And I don't think we shouldn't look anywhere else. I think that we should actually look in terms of material culture. That will simply be studied. The historians will gather the information coming from all these other various branches. What we have to look at is historically, of course, at the sources, the battle accounts. And even if weapons and arms and armor are, of course, sources as well, again, we must give to them the concrete dimension that they really, concrete importance that they really have. Right? And that's it. And all this problem, of course, happens because we only looked into our narrower field, right? For the rest, again, I'm completely fine about these tests being carried out. Again, they are interesting. They can surely tell us a lot about material culture of the time and, you know, broader considerations of how these things were made. And what kind of, probably also what degree of sophistication was, I mean, what kind of, an interesting thing is how many options would there be on the ground of testing, right, for using, for example, different types of heads. It's still very kind of hypothetical, but in theory one could say, well, maybe you have more or less reason to realize how effective such reconstructions also are. They could help to reconstruct things better. And again, having an idea of how these pieces were made. But again, as far as medieval warfare is involved as a whole, I think that what can derive from this is very scarce at best. And so there are two different levels of interest that can, again, surely find a meeting ground, but also are fundamentally answering different type of questions that are pretty distant, again, in scale from one another. And that makes us also relatively aware of how, in part, distracting the attention towards too much kind of material side of the story really is, especially talking about warfare in general, right? And I could, again, digress easily on why this came to be, why it happened. Of course, these kind of replicas and tests were done since, it was a lot. Napoleon III was a great enthusiast of these things. The Victorian age also reevaluated, of course, the Middle Ages, longbow, etc. So these are interesting questions, but it's also evident that they are born in a moment of it's the industrial age, and so at most a great separation from the literally detachment from people from the practical nature of things, which doesn't mean, and this is the trick too, that material things are practical and theoretical things are impractical. Theoretical things are the most practical, quite strongly so, and warfare is quite a struggle on that level, as von Clausewitz also teaches regarding, in fact, for example, the moment of decision in command and more, because again, you are actually operating in war with means that are already given. So of course you have to know more or less what these do, and you will know it only through studying battle accounts, not making testing, let's say, because not even what will happen in battle is considered as predictable. And that's the entire point of the story. This is very important historically too. Again, the entire Clausewitz theory is being expressed by a guy who he fought throughout all the revolutionary wars, and was a general in the Prussian army, right, fighting also at Waterloo and so on. So this guy, of course, had troops at his disposal. Also in those times, Western warfare was perfectly homogeneous. And of course, what he cared about in strategy was moral forces and how to use your military instrument in a way that would function along those patterns. Everybody was given arms and armor, right? Tactically, strategically, you don't study how people were supplied. That is conceptually separated, right? How they are equipped, how they are armed, in fact, because in the moment of the battle, it's over, right? It also, as we were seeing, didn't, if it was different, of course, because of, say, an army was underarmed, in fact, or undersupplied, whatever, still, you kind of had an idea of the broader effect that this had, which is a moral one rather than a material one as well. And you would feel it through ways that are also, in fact, very difficult to describe and write down, but that are accumulated through that military experience. And in the absence of it, however, the integration, still also when you have that, with military historical knowledge, that is to say, what happened in battles that were actually fought in reality, and not some replicas that are completely detached from the actual historical context, even if they were just very accurate, spot-on arms and armor. Still, they are completely detached from a 14th century battlefield, and so you cannot know how they perform because you don't even know how they're supposed to be used, other than being shot, right? Because they were used just mostly in collective fashion, and for very specific combined armed tactics. And that's what really made the broader difference. So again, how little that is compared to the world is the measure of it. And that's pretty much it. We're talking about armies that, again, fought against identical opponents, and where they would find the most different ones, they wouldn't even venture, because they would be at the outskirts of the world, and they didn't even care about it. It was already a big deal to wage war at some hundred of kilometers there. So it is literally it, right? And I would I answered this question because I have many questions, right? But sometimes I need to reassert, to rephrase, to re-explain most of what I already told as well, in terms that can, say, in a way that, first of all, can more concretely be heard, and also in a way that can hopefully, help positively and practically, right? And never, again, falling under the impression that who doesn't handle arms and armor replicas from the Middle Ages understands medieval warfare better than who studies it from a chair and amidst books, because it has literally nothing to do even with the theory of the art of war and the practice of the art of war. And in any case, right, in each way, in its own influent way, in fact. And so that's my simple take on it. We have been habituated too much to think, again, that everything gets down to the effects, right? We, as a culture, as a civilization, in a traditionally universal way, we should be able to think the causes. And so to train ourselves to reason with a bigger mind, rather than sticking to what the material consequence that actually is. And that's, I think it's very powerful. Again, I hope this video is not too, I don't say any of this by criticizing the necessarily or the author of the question at all. I just have in mind so many other examples that those are enough, let's say, to address altogether. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.